The bottom line of the A, you notice in verse 7, the word accepted was used. The actual word accepted means to be elevated, to be lifted up. And it actually, figuratively, it means with elation or cheerfulness, to be exalted in rank. In other words, what he's saying to him is, Cain, I made you in my image and likeness. You have got the actual dignity of a son of God. If you do well, you will maintain that elevation and that dignity. Right now you're angry and your countenance is fallen, but it doesn't have to. You see, appeasement kind of leads to religion, and it leads to a fallen countenance. If you're trying to perform all the time for God, you're never really going to hit that happy place. Like a mouse in a treadmill, it just keeps going. You never get there, because you're never quite sure if God's happy with you or not. The opposite side of that is the place where Abel lives. Abel lives in a place where he knows he's walking in the image and likeness of God. He's taking care of sheep. He's the first shepherd, if you would. He knows that he can walk in an elevated, accepted place because he is. It's not a matter of what he does. He has the dignity already. He doesn't have to earn it. And he's not trying to appease God. He appreciates. He loves God, if you would. Appreciation is a word that we would use with respect to a relationship. And it leads to this idea of acceptance and elevation, dignity. We're not talking about how God feels about us. It's how we'll end up feeling about ourselves. And that becomes an important key. But if you do well, you'll feel good about yourself. If you don't, you won't feel so good about yourself. You don't have to appease me. I appreciate you. And knowing that can cause us to respond in like kind. So I think the A has to do with trying to appease God or express an appreciation. When we're flowing in the appreciation, then we appreciate others. The B, bother or brother. Do we find it a bother to have to think about others, or do we recognize the brotherhood, if you would? Now, Russ, would you read the first 2 verses again?
Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground.
It's weird, isn't it? If you really look at it, here we get the woman, Eve, having this baby boy. I've got a man-child, Cain! Woohoo! And she had Abel. It really gets exciting when you look at what their names actually mean. The name Cain actually means like a lance, something that strikes quickly. Well, here's what Abel means. To be vain, empty, transitory, and unsatisfactory. Now, how's that for a good name? By the way it's described, which is no description at all. It makes it sound like Cain is the man. And Abel, I'm not even sure how necessary the kid is, because I got Cain. The words, what they mean, expresses a type of ownership. I've got Cain. In this chapter, 7 times, it's going to talk about brother. Now, I could see it once or twice slipping in there. But after a while, it's sort of like, I know he's my brother. Do you? I've said it 7 times and you're still killing him. I'm not sure how much you do recognize he's your brother. Bother or brother. It says that Cain is a tiller, Abel's a keeper. And the keeper is the same word that David uses when he says, the Lord is my shepherd. It's a word for shepherd. He's a keeper of sheep. He's a shepherd. He's the first shepherd in the Bible. Whereas tiller, there's nothing wrong with the word tiller. It basically means to work. That gets kind of interesting because that's what Adam, the man, was consigned to in Genesis 2, to work the ground, to be a tiller of the ground. It also, this word, this tiller, also carries with it an element of being enslaved. Abel is a shepherd of the sheep. He's not enslaved to them. He cares. He takes care of them. They're tilling the ground, and in the previous chapter, the ground was cursed. All it's going to bring is thorns and thistles. Cain is the older one. He would have had the choice what he was going to do as a career. He chooses to till the cursed ground, which is okay. You can go back and say, well, this is part of the commissioning in Genesis to till the ground. But the word in Hebrew carries with it the idea of being enslaved. Do you remember any other older brother who was working the farm with a slave mentality? The prodigal son, the older brother. All these years I've worked for you. Worked for me all these years? It's your flippin' farm. Really what we're looking at is a very interesting kind of spiritual development that the first Adam, the first man, is a Cain. It isn't Ishmael, a mocker, an Esau that only wants to feed its stomach. The elder brother falls in that category. But God made it clear the elder shall serve the younger. In other words, the first is natural, like Paul says. The second is spiritual. What I'm trying to say is this. As we look at this B of bother or brother, The natural says this is a pain that starts in the neck and works its way down. I don't see them as a brother. I see him as a bother. The spiritual man says this is my brother from another mother and sees everybody as our brother. The bottom line of the A was accepted. The bottom line of the B, I had tossed around different words until I found out what to do well meant. If you make something well, it literally means in the Hebrew to make a beautiful sound. It's the same word for sound when it says they heard the voice of the Lord walking in the garden. It says, when he says to Adam, you obeyed the voice of your wife, and she never said a word. In other words, voice doesn't mean speaking like I'm speaking now. It means the entire personification. In our interaction with our brother, we make this beautiful sound that makes them well, that makes all things well. Now, there's a lot more to be said here. This is the first time that sin is mentioned, which is kind of interesting, because if you asked anybody to say, tell me where the first sin is in the Bible, we would go to Genesis 3, and it's never mentioned in Genesis 3, which should make us kind of at least think twice about a lot of the theology that we've been taught, that we preach, that we can't substantiate. It's like there's two sides to the coin. There's the offense and the penalty that comes along with it. You can't separate them. The offense and the penalty come together, which is why it says sin and death entered the world, because you can't separate them. It's like two sides of the same coin. And it says that sin is crouching at the door. Psalm 24 talks about us being gates. And one of two things is going to prevail in those gates. Jesus says, I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail in your life. You will not be a gate that hell passes back and forth and through. So there's this reference being made that sin is crouching at the gates, and its desire is to ruin you. Remember, you've got sin is the offense and the penalty. But then he says an interesting thing. I don't know how we balance this out with our theology and our doctrine. Do you notice how he said, but you will rule over it? I've been taught that, we're all born with original sin, and until we're Christians, until we're saved, we can't overcome sin. We can't rule over sin. But here God is talking to Cain and saying, you should rule over it. There's a lot in this section. I'm not trying to mess with your heads or anything like that. I'm just saying there's a lot more to what's going on, because I'm looking at God through this thing. I'm looking at the God who says that when you're in that spiritual place, you rule over sin. You just get on with making a beautiful sound, and sin has no authority, no power, or anything else. You see, part of me wonders, Paul says, sin and death entered the world through Adam, but we don't find either one in the 3rd chapter. We find them in the 4th chapter. We find sin mentioned, and we find the first death. I'm not saying it wasn't Adam's fault. It definitely was. But it looks as though Adam invited it in the door, and it manifested itself through Cain. We've had the A's, appeasement or appreciation. Bottom line is accepted. Bother or brother. Bottom line is beautiful, making a beautiful sound. We get to the C, and I put side by side contempt or care. Now, we watch movies, or maybe you've been in a court of law where somebody's held in contempt of court. Contempt of court can either be somebody's attitude, they're rude, and the judge says you're showing contempt in my courtroom by your attitude. Or contempt of court can be a willful, knowing act of disobedience. That becomes intriguing to me. I look at the situation with Cain, and I see both. I see a crappy attitude. It's not even what I see, it's what God says. He's angry, and God asks him. And the word carries with it in the Hebrew, you're jealous, you're flaring up like you're on fire with zeal for the wrong reasons. You're absolutely fuming with jealousy. He's in contempt. He is not in care. And he asks that when God says, where is Abel, your brother? His response to God is an elder brother response. It's one of mocking God. Am I my brother's keeper? Now, this keeper is not the Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. This keeper is the word that was used in the 2nd chapter about the garden. You shall tend it and keep it. And remember, that word means to protect and to guard. He's basically saying to God, what am I, his babysitter? God is gracious. He's not like me, that's for sure. I say, you're in contempt. He's showing an absolute disdain for his brother. Well, he's already killed him at this point. And he's showing a contempt for God, for the whole system, if you would. The fascinating thing to me is in Genesis 3, the question is, where are you? In Genesis 4, where is your brother? They're powerful questions, saying you should be asking yourself this. Where are you as a result of the decision you made? Where is your brother? When he says, am I my brother's keeper? God could have said, yeah, as a matter of fact, you are. You're his older brother, first of all. And second of all, you're brothers. I know he seems like a bother to you, but he's your brother. And I know you hold him in contempt because, like John says in his epistle, Cain was of the wicked one. Why did he kill his brother? Because his brother's works were righteous and his were not. He tried to pull one on God, and God didn't let him. Why? Because God's a just God? No, because he loves Cain. And he wants him to know, number one, you don't have to appease me. I've already accepted you. I've already made you in my image and my likeness. I've given you the dignity of being a human being. By the way, Cain, your life is not going to end. But there is a dimension of it that's going to end. We know that Abel's blood was spilled, and there's different scriptures in the New Testament. It's interesting how many times the blood of Abel is mentioned by Jesus and by other writers. It's interesting. In Hebrews 12:24, would you read that?
To Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel.
It's talking about the church, and we've been called to Jesus. The voice of Abel's blood is crying out to me. The life is in the blood. Abel's life is crying out to me from the ground. One of the most horrendous things about murder is not just taking the life of the person, but every possible life that could have come from the loins, from the genes of that person. You've cut off millions of untold lives, not just the life of the person. When you think of it that way, it becomes absolutely unbelievable. We said earlier that Abel, the name Abel, just means like empty, unsatisfactory, worthless. And God's saying, I hear the voice of the nobodies screaming to me from the ground. See, the question has to be asked, who's listening to the voice of our brother's empty life? These are the hidden questions in this chapter. Did you notice towards the end that God cuts a covenant, basically, makes a covenant with Cain? He basically pronounces a curse. He tells him, your best days are not ahead of you, but I'm going to put a mark, basically, on Cain so that nobody harms you. Cain makes the comment, my punishment is more than I can bear. And that sounds like, is God, you're punishing me and I can't cope. That's not exactly what it means. The word punishment is the word that's used for iniquity throughout the whole Old Testament. I'm not sure if you know the difference between iniquities and transgressions. Transgression is what Adam and Eve did. They had a word from God and they disobeyed. That's a transgression. An iniquity, all of us in this room have iniquities. They are within us. They're our propensity to sin. They're like the fuel in the tank. And what Cain is actually saying is this iniquity that I bear within myself is more than I can handle. And it's almost like, parenthetically, he's crying out, can't I be forgiven? Can't we do something about this?